Welcome back to 1834. The score is 1 game each and it's the first to win 5 games that will take this 6th match. Today's guest commentator is Fatty from the Bash Street Kids. Now strangely, Bourdonnais is playing once more as white for the 3rd game in a row. There may be a very good explanation for that, but I will save it for a later video. For now, Bourdonnais starts with e4, e5 from McDonnell, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, bishop to c5, and of course, Bourdonnais goes for the Evans Gambit. And everyone knows that all gentlemen must accept a Gambit, and McDonnell, he's a gentleman, so of course he accepts. We have c3, pushing the bishop back, it goes back to a5, and now from here, Bourdonnais takes the time to castle. We have d6, letting the light square bishop out, and d4 into the center, leading to a pawn exchange. The bishop now goes back to b6, lining up against the king, but Bourdonnais ignores it, and he just brings his bishop up to b2. We have knight to f6, clearing space for castling, d5 attacking this knight, but it only comes forward to attack the white square bishop, and it goes back to d3. McDonnell takes the opportunity to castle here, and up to this point they have played exactly the same moves as in game number 1. In that game we had, from here, knight to c3, and then bishop to g4, pinning the knight, h3 trying to chase away the bishop, and the bishop went back to h5, and shortly after here, Bourdonnais played g4, weakened his king side, and McDonnell won after only 27 moves. However, this time, instead of this knight to c3 move, Bourdonnais played h3 early, and from here, we have a completely new game. Now from here we know that McDonnell likes to push his f-pawn, so to prepare for this he moves his knight out of the way. Bourdonnais simply develops his queen off the back rank, and indeed we have f5. Now here, Fatty would like to weigh in. He says that instead of just capturing the pawn here, maybe you should think about pushing straight past it. You might end up in a better position. But Bourdonnais doesn't want to think about it. He captures the pawn, and the light square bishop captures back. Now, here, we know that McDonnell does like to sacrifice the bishop to try to gain some advantage, so maybe Bourdonnais should think about maybe playing king to h2 to add some defense to this, but he doesn't. Instead, he decides to complete his development with knight to c3, and indeed, McDonnell goes for the bishop sack. The bishop captures on h3. Not to be outdone, Bourdonnais goes for the bishop sack, and he sacrifices his bishop on h7. Now Fatty, who is on a seafood diet, he sees food, he eats it, says that if McDonnell captures here, then chaos happens on the board. For example, the knight's coming to g5 and it's forking the bishop here. After the king moves, the knight captures the bishop, but the black knight is coming off the rim and it's forking the king and the white bishop. So after the queen moves and the exchange happens on the corner, what's the result? Well, McDonnell is still up the gambited pawn and the pieces are coming off the table, so McDonnell is actually winning. However, McDonnell isn't having any of Bourdonnais' funny business. He decides not to capture the bishop. Instead, he moves the king into the corner on h8, and we continue. Bourdonnais gets the bishop out of there all the way back to c2. But McDonnell really wants to sacrifice a piece, so he captures the knight with the rook. Bourdonnais says, okay, if you insist, I'm going to capture one of these 2 pieces, and I'm going for the rook. And this is a problem, although admittedly, if he had captured the bishop instead, it probably would have been just as bad. So from here, knight to c4 is pretty devastating. The queen can't get off of this diagonal because it needs to protect from the black queen coming in. So, well, what can you do? If you bring it back to c1, then you're just going to capture the bishop, and then of course you can't capture back with the queen, because as we said, that's very interesting. Lichess just killed my connection. Okay, so that was very strange. It only lasted a few seconds, but was very disruptive to the recording of this video. I decided to leave it in just to show you the kind of things that can happen while you're trying to make a chess video. As I was saying, I'll just wind it back. After the pawn captures the rook, McDonnell is able to play knight to c4, and after queen to c1, keeping an eye on this square so the black queen can't come in. If the knight captures here and the queen captures it back, it's going to be a very swift checkmate after the king moves here. However, McDonnell did not play this knight to c4 move. Instead, he brought the queen all the way into h4 and decided to try to put up the pressure this way. Bourdonnais plays knight to e2, and this reveals a pin on the pawn and the king in the corner. McDonnell is still winning by a lot, but he needs to defend here. For example, king to g8 to break the pin, but instead he doesn't break the pin. He plays rook to f8, and this allows Bourdonnais to attack. Bourdonnais starts his attack with queen to h6, it's check, and of course the pawn can't capture because it's still pinned by the dark square bishop. So after the king moves to g8, Bourdonnais follows up with the light square bishop. It's check again, and the king has to move again. It's somewhat exposed now, and Fatty says that maybe capturing the pawn with the dark square bishop here would tip the scales, but instead Bourdonnais goes for bishop to g6, and again it's check, and this move is probably just as good because after the king moves, Bourdonnais is winning the knight and offering a queen exchange, and McDonnell accepts the queen exchange. Meanwhile, this dark well, it's a light square bishop, but it's a dark bishop, is eyeing up the rook, and McDonnell decides to capture it right now, and the king captures back on f1. So let's quickly check the material that's left after all of that. McDonnell has his pawns in good shape. In fact, he's still up the gambited pawn, whereas Bourdonnais is somewhat wrecked, but Bourdonnais does have an extra light square bishop, and we now expect him to win. But the game's not over yet. Let's see what McDonnell comes up with to save it. He plays rook to f5, and this attacks the light square bishop and also attacks the pawn. Bourdonnais saves the bishop by bringing it back to g4, and of course McDonnell captures the pawn. We have now knight to f4 attacking the rook, but the rook comes down trying to cause more trouble on d2, eyeing up this dark square bishop. But Bourdonnais brings his rook across to e1, and this is of course check, so McDonnell doesn't have time to capture the bishop. The king goes back to f8, and now we have rook to e2 offering the rook exchange, and McDonnell decides that he's going to accept here, and the king captures back. So McDonnell did manage to win an extra pawn. He's now got 5 to Bourdonnais' 3, but he's still down the light square bishop. McDonnell continues with knight to c4, threatening the dark square bishop, but Bourdonnais just ignores it and brings his knight up here to give a check on the king, but also it's also forking the black pawn here, which is double attacked with the bishop. So after the king moves, Bourdonnais picks up this pawn, and everything is defended. The knight's guarding the dark square bishop while the light square bishop is guarding the knight, and the game continues with c5. Bourdonnais says, I can push pawns to f5, and McDonnell keeps coming with d5. Maybe he can make something with these connected passed pawns, but meanwhile Bourdonnais keeps pushing to f5. Now, McDonnell doesn't want this knight to get stuck out in the front here with the bishops cutting through the diagonals. It could end up getting trapped. He brings it back to help with the defense with knight to d6, and we have bishop to e5 now, threatening the knight. It's undefended, so McDonnell brings it back all the way onto his pack rank, but now this walks into a check and a skewer from the bishop. So what does the king do? The king goes to e7, and of course the bishop is picking up the knight, and the king recaptures the bishop, and it's back to square one on the back rank. But Bourdonnais keeps coming with his f-pawn. It's looking quite dangerous now, and McDonnell's pawns seem to be lagging behind, but he tries to advance them anyway. He plays c4. But now comes knight to g5. It's covering this square to allow the pawn to advance. What does McDonnell do? Well, he brings his bishop up to c5 to defend the queening square, but regardless, Bourdonnais pushes f7 and gives a check. Of course, you can't capture because it is protected by the knight, as we said, so the king has to move. It comes forward to d7, and Bourdonnais simply brings his bishop up to g7, and now nothing is going to stop this pawn queening, and McDonnell is going to have to give up his dark square bishop for the queen. So enough was enough in this position, and McDonnell decided that he was going to have to resign the game. Bourdonnais is now winning 2 games to 1. I will see you again next time.